Welcome to Frankly Speaking, the podcast on responsible business from Responsible Companies Frank Bold. I'm Richard Howitt, and after many years of leading debates about responsible business in the European Parliament, I host our discussions about corporate sustainability, sustainable finance, business and human rights. Today, we welcome the Regional Chief Executive for one of the world's foremost conservation organisations, the Worldwide Fund for Nature, WWF, in the region of Central and Eastern Europe, Andreas Beckmann. Andreas is also chair of the organisation's Worldwide Committee for Global Partnerships and Corporate Engagement, and we'll be discussing what he's learned about how companies working with NGOs in the sustainability space. Andreas, welcome to Frankly Speaking.
Thanks a lot, Richard. Pleased to be here.
Now, as I often ask my guests, before we get on to the principal subject, a bit about you. How did you first get into nature conservation, sustainability in your life, in your career? Where did it first come from?
I gave a TEDx talk basically on this topic some years ago. I guess the long story is that I took a very circuitous route that included the US, stops in Germany, Moscow, Prague, working in a bank, a hospital, experiential education, translation, journalism, almost finished a PhD in history. Important influences were my experiences of wilderness and awe of nature, both scientifically, but also, I would say, spiritually, but also the example that I had in Prague, especially the conscience of dissidents and their example for people like Václav Havel. And I guess the short story is that I had my quarter-life crisis at the ripe age of 26 or so, and started volunteering for Czech environmental groups, and that led to eventually to a career working for the environment, first for a Czech environmental foundation, and since 2001 for WWF.
Wow, that was a lot in a very short answer. And to combine spirituality with political and democratic protest and revolution, and then the volunteering element, which I often hear from my guests, that's a fantastic story, and it'd be great to hear more about it on other occasions. Now, WWF calls Central and Eastern Europe, where you're based, the quote, green heart of Europe. So for our Frankly Speaking listeners, both in the region but also in the rest of Europe and worldwide, why do you use that phrase?
The green heart of Europe. Because the region, and I'm talking in this case, it's actually more Central and Southeastern Europe, countries, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Ukraine, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, that I'm specifically responsible for. But I think generally more Central and Eastern Europe more overall, including Poland, for example. These are countries that include a large part of Europe's remaining natural treasures. These are the largest areas of old growth forests are in these areas, rivers and wetlands and so on.
So I guess the comparison is we often talk about the rainforests in Latin America. So you're, in essence, what you're saying is that Europe's precious biodiversity and nature is found in that region, and perhaps we don't hear that enough.
A very large part of them are indeed. One indicator is perhaps large carnivores like bears, wolves, species that need large, relatively untouched areas. And the hotspots are certainly in the eastern part of the continent. That's because of historical developments. These areas are relatively less developed than areas further west, and so on. So lots of different reasons for that. But certainly we have a lot of natural capital in this area that's worth preserving.
Now, in your current post, but also in your previous one, you've been integrally involved in the Living Danube Partnership, European Union's longest river. Is the Danube still blue? And if so, why? And what have companies done to contribute to that?
Yeah, the Danube question is whether it ever was blue. I think it has a bit of marketing right there. That said, the Danube has gotten much cleaner, certainly. The collapse of the Soviet regime in the past, the removal of dirty factories and businesses certainly helped with that, but then also a lot of the EU legislation that has pushed for much cleaner industry, factories, and so on, development, lots and lots of investment in waste treatment, for example. So certainly the Danube today is much cleaner than it was in the 1970s. There's remaining problems in the Danube with regard to what we call non-point sources of pollution. So this is especially agricultural runoff from fertilizer, pesticides, and that kind of a thing, which is much more difficult to deal with than the more point sources, for example, individual factories or cities and their waste.
And what about WWF's work with companies in particular in pursuing those goals?
We've been working especially on conservation and restoration of rivers and wetlands. How is that connected with companies? It's basically the basis for our freshwater ecosystems, which ultimately the watersheds are important for companies. So we've been working for many years with the Coca-Cola Company, initially funded through the Coca-Cola Foundation, investing in wetland restoration, and through that have restored, I think it's well over 5,000 hectares of wetland areas, almost 14 million cubic meters of water replenished. This is all relevant for the water that on which companies like Coca-Cola, of course, a beverage company, directly depends. But in fact, every company is dependent directly or indirectly on water. Unfortunately, too few companies actually realize this until it's too late.
And as you say, the water restoration is very important for a company like Coca-Cola. I can see that. But I'm aware that that work is very cross-sector between NGOs, governments and companies. And actually won the Gift for the Earth Award from WWF, so it's an outstanding example internationally in terms of nature restoration. You see in Brussels that there is controversy over nature restoration and whether the targets can be met within the timescale. Have you got any comment about that?
I think we are optimistic that it can be achieved, and we've been showing that. I mentioned some of the wetland restoration, but there are also other areas as well. It's like many things, it's a question of political will. And the kind of backsliding, the doubts that have crept in over the last couple of years certainly are not helping that. We are doing our best in the region to actually drive things forward and show how things can be actually done, and how it benefits people and nature ultimately. I mean, the reason why this legislation, the reason why these targets exist are not just some abstract target, but actually for the benefit of nature and people. And we depend on this, on the natural world for our welfare, our well-being, our health, very basic, goods and services that we depend on. Especially in the light of climate change, where holding on to these ecosystems helps increase our resilience.
And I know you've commented that governments are sometimes prone to just wanting to build deeper dikes and higher flood defences, and in fact that's a very short-term rather than a long-term solution. Just for companies that are being asked for money or asked for cooperation to achieve these things, just explain that argument.
Indeed, and maybe the best way to talk about that is to look at an example. If we take the northeastern part of Hungary, the Tisza Basin, so the Tisza River is a tributary to the Danube that starts in Ukraine, goes through Hungary, into Serbia, into the Danube. And over the last 150 years, it has been straightened, cut off from the floodplains, like many rivers in Europe. And one of the results is that as a result of this and other things, essentially Hungary is drying out, literally. So there's more water leaving the country than actually coming in. As a result, the groundwater levels are going down, soil moisture is disappearing, and this is increasingly having effects on agriculture. Not least the response to this, it's nothing new, but the response to this for many years has been just to pump more water. And of course, that isn't a sustainable solution. And now the Hungarian government, the authorities are realizing that and changing that. I would say it's a fundamental paradigm shift that's happening. We're going towards working with nature rather than against it, and we've been driving that very much in that direction.
And in Hungary, but also in Czechia and I think in Slovakia, you've also done a great deal of work on food systems, from the farmer to the food manufacturer or processor to the consumer. There are a lot of companies that are very active in that field. What are some of the lessons you've learned from that work?
We did some interesting work in the past with a major retailer, Tesco. And what was interesting for me from that cooperation was the synergies between us. On the one hand, we come with our approaches, but when you talk, for example, about shaping consumer choice, they of course know how to do that better than anybody else. They know exactly. So we had these situations where we'd sit down with their experts, their marketing experts, and talk about how can you influence that consumer choice simply by putting where you put the goods on the supermarket shelves, or what colors do you use, and that kind of a thing. What we can do is challenge them and provide, let's say, the objective from a sustainability perspective, but then working with them, they can actually make it happen. That's exciting.
Great example. And I want to ask you about Ukraine. You cover Ukraine too. Twice we've had podcasts about sustainability, business and human rights in Ukraine, and I think a lot of our listeners really care about the situation in Ukraine. At Frank Bold, we've got a colleague who's literally there fighting, who is part of our team. We've talked about business and human rights in Ukraine in the podcast, but we've not talked specifically about nature and wildlife and how the conflict there, how the Russian invasion there is affecting nature on the front line. I know you've got some strong feelings and evidence about that. Tell us about that.
Yeah, the Ukraine war is it's a disaster in all ways. Obviously, a tragedy for humans, but also for the environment on which they depend. And it's hard to get a grasp of it, just the same as with the human suffering, of course. You can talk about it in terms of hectares of protected areas that have been affected by the war. About 40% of the country's protected areas is about 1.24 million hectares are affected by the war. From everything from forests that have been burned, fighting going on directly in them, and otherwise affected. Other issues, of course, from all of the missile attacks and so on, that have then impacts in terms of releasing toxic chemicals and so on. Like I say, it's really difficult to put your head around it. There have been some numbers that have been bandied around. I think it was last year, an estimate came out, I think it was put out by the Ukrainian government, that over 100 billion euros of damage has been done to the environment. That's certainly grown since then. And it's also difficult to say, how do you actually put your finger on that, especially under the circumstances of the war.
And Frank Bold, we're in touch with the Green Transition Office of the Ukrainian government, and it's very impressive how they are still pursuing those goals, even in the midst of conflict. Now let's move to your role, Andreas, if we may, as chair of WWF's Committee for Global Partnerships and Corporate Engagement. And a simple question first, although many of our listeners are living with this every day, let's establish the argument from first principles. What is the business case for nature? Why should companies care?
I mean, to put it bluntly, you can't do business on a dead planet. Of course, that's putting it to the extreme, but many companies still don't realize it, but directly and indirectly, business depends on nature and the goods and services it provides. It underpins our collective survival, the well-being by providing human development, equality, economic value. If we look at the world's GDP, about 50% of the world's GDP is being highly or moderately dependent on nature. So that's the big picture. How does that come down to the microeconomy? It's everything from, depending on what your line of business is, obviously agriculture, food, and the retail related to that, highly dependent not just on pollinators, but then also the supply of water. I mentioned before this case in the Tisa Basin that the agriculture is directly impacted by decisions regarding the wetlands and rivers and how they have been managed in the past. But also, if you look at about 90% of the pressures on the biodiversity is coming from food, from fashion, from energy, and from infrastructure. So also from that perspective, there's a really big impact on the natural world on which we depend.
And when we talked before this recording, you said this is not just CSR when you go to companies. What do you mean by that? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I was the rapporteur for corporate social responsibility for many years, but I've been at many meetings where they say CSR is dead. But in your terms that you were just talking about there, why do you say this is not CSR? And if it's not CSR, what is it?
Yeah. So I think what I was referring to there was that for many years, WWF and also other organizations were working with the private sector in the sense of fundraising, essentially. And very often, usually, the funding or the things that were supported didn't have anything really to do with the core business of the company itself. That has changed and is more the standard that we have now. I think companies have realized their dependence on nature, also the issues of climate change. And so that's one side of it. On the other side of it, environmental organizations and WWF, certainly among those, realizing that without companies that actually have such a big impact on the world around us, we can't achieve our priorities. So public policy is not enough, and especially the case in the region where I work, where we have a lot of very good legislation, most of it from the EU, on paper, but unfortunately a lot of it does not turn into practice. And so it's not enough just to point. We also need to also actually get in there and try to actually make things happen. Otherwise it doesn't happen.
I don't want to defend my past work, but CSR for me and many of us at the time was never just about philanthropy from companies. It was about the business models of the companies and what they were doing in their actual business to both help and minimise harm to in the environment and to human beings.
I agree on that, but just maybe if I can just say that the reason why I refer to as CSR is because we often are referred to the CSR person in the company, and that's usually not the right person, because what they're doing is kind of community support, and it's that the money that's put to the side because the company feels like it should be doing something. And what we're talking about is, no, we actually need to talk to the CEOs, we need to talk to the chief procurement officer, we need to talk to the operations.
I can hear chief sustainability officers in companies worldwide shrieking at that answer, but in essence, we're all in agreement, aren't we? That it's about the business. It's not just about giving a few bits of money on the side to self-conscience. So, and hopefully that is much better understood now than it was 10 and 20 years ago. And I pay credit to WWF for the work that you've done to influence that. Because you are overseeing partnerships, you are looking at a really tricky balance or equation, which is NGOs, whether it's WWF or other renowned NGOs that we all know in the world, want to have genuine partnerships with companies, not just to gain money, but to genuinely seek cooperation in a mutual way. But they also want to be independent from companies and be able to criticise and to hold companies to account. And that's a tricky balancing act, not just from the NGO's point of view, but from the company's point of view as well. What have you learned about how to deal with that?
What I've learned is it comes down to relationships and building trust, because in a partnership, there will be those moments where you have a crisis coming up, and it can be from either side. and you need to be able to work through that. And if it's a robust partnership, you need to be able to then have a certain level of trust to be able to deal with that. I think that's most fundamental. It's about relationships, and of course, the official level of the relationships is important, but at some point, it also comes down to very fundamentally individual, personal relationships. So we have been able to be much more successful, where we had somebody across the table from us that we could that thought alike, and that we could see eye to eye. If there were problems that came up, that we could then ask them. We've had that, with companies where they've seemed to step away from some of their environmental commitments, where we've been able to challenge them and ask them the backstory about that, and then be able to address it. And you need a certain level of trust for that.
You recently had the Institute for International Business from WWF to make recommendations about how WWF in your region can better work with business. Were there some of their recommendations that are interesting to share with our audience?
So we have this cooperation with the WU, and as part of that, we had a number of students put together business cases for how we could engage with different industries. And they were very useful. So I spent one very intense morning, 20 minutes a piece, 10 cases. And in terms of a wide range, and one or two of them we're actually probably going to follow up on. In other cases, just helps us to understand the bigger picture. Everything from mining, which is something that we will probably not get involved with, but certainly will be involved with telecommunications in terms of raising awareness, and also companies, for example, in Romania that we hadn't even heard about, but that have a very big footprint in terms of feed so within the broader agriculture sector. Very, very useful in that case.
That is interesting. And some of our listeners will say you shouldn't need a business case to do the right thing, and that by reducing action on the environment and on business and human rights to a business case, you're missing the impact, the external impact of the company. But you're saying that you're finding those suggestions helpful. How would you respond to the critics on that, and would you share some of the concerns, or is this just the reality today and going into the future?
My experience is where we can be most effective is where there is a clear business case for the company, where they can understand why it's important for them. There's a material issue involved for them, which makes sense, right? From a company perspective. It's also a business case for us, because not everything, we've got very limited resources and capacity, and so we can't get into everything ourselves either. Of course, it would be great if everything sorted itself out and everybody worked in the most sustainable manner. That's why it's important to have some of the legislation that we have and to hold on to onto that legislation as well, so that we can have that playing field. We need those business cases in the end.
And as you talk about legislation and water, there's obviously a debate going on again about the water directives from Brussels.
Again,
I know it's a passionate issue for you, from what you said earlier in the podcast, as well as from knowing you from before. What's your message to Brussels lawmakers on that? Periodically
comes up. We have these fitness checks, and they find that the water legislation that we have, especially the Water Framework Directive, is a central piece of that, is fit for purpose. We need to implement it, and that's the same problem that we have with the Nature Directives. Also has another fitness check for that. It is clear the problem is not the legislation. It's very progressive and very powerful legislation, but it needs to be implemented, and that's where we need to focus. And by ignoring the problem, we are not going to make any progress on that. And we need to, again, come back to, realizing that the legislation, it's not just legislation for legislation's sake. It is legislation to hold on to the water resources on which we all depend, to hold on to the nature, the natural world on which we all depend, that provides the goods and services on which we all depend.
I think this is going to be the last question, Andreas. Given that many of our listeners are sustainability people in businesses, and given all the current developments and all the challenges that you and we are dealing with, what is your message now to companies?
Take action, realize the dependencies that you have as a company on the natural world, on water, on natural resources. Like I said before, somewhat flippantly, but seriously, you can't do business on a dead planet. Many companies, especially in our region, don't realize the dependency that they have on the natural world, and we need to hold on to that. And that should be the framing for the legislation and for the implementation of that legislation and the understanding of that. So move forward, I think, is the main one. There's organizations like WWF that can, we're happy to work with somewhere where our interests align and where we can move something forward.
In this podcast, we've heard that Central and Eastern Europe is at the heart of biodiversity and nature for the whole of Europe, and is precious and needs to be addressed. We've heard examples from some big name companies. Sometimes you might call them the usual suspects, but Coca-Cola and Tesco, who have genuinely contributed to the work with WWF. And Andreas made the point that they have, for example, expertise in marketing that can really assist the environmental movement in shaping customer choice and citizen behaviour. We've heard of the importance of the directives in the European Union, both on nature restoration, where Andreas remains optimistic about the targets being able to be met, and also the Water Framework Directive. And he's put the case not for changing those directives, but by putting extra emphasis on implementation. We've heard that the challenges are many. He talked about Hungary literally drying out as a country. I've not heard that said in quite that way before, and it certainly should make us think. And we've heard how the war in Ukraine has affected about 40% of the protected environmental spaces, damaged them in real terms, and it's something that it is difficult to put in the same context as all of the human cost of the war, but something that doesn't often get said and should be said, so I'm grateful for him to do that. Andreas talked about the relationship that exists between NGOs and companies, that it must be about the core business, not simply a bit of philanthropy on the side. He talked about building trust, and particularly trust with individuals, the actual interlocutors that meet NGOs, and vice versa, of course. And he unapologetically said that they've looked at business cases for each of the areas of action that they want to pursue, and they're comfortable with that, and they actually feel that is where action by companies and through partnerships can be most effective. And at the end, Andreas said, if you're in a company that doesn't understand your dependencies on nature and the natural world, now is the time to really consider that and to take action. Andreas, I'm sorry that we've come to the end of our time, but thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Frankly Speaking, the Frank Bold podcast on responsible business. Find out more about Frank Bold's Responsible Companies section on our website, and please give us your feedback on our LinkedIn page or by commenting via your podcast provider, where we hope you will share the conversation and give this podcast a 5-star rating. And remember, you can watch us now on our YouTube channel too. Thank you again so much to Andreas Beckmann. Good luck with all your future work. Thanks to all of you for listening. Do join us next time, and goodbye.